Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for joining us today as we consider the President's fiscal year 2012 budget request for the Department of Defense. On Monday, I had the opportunity to sit down with Secretary Gates to discuss this request. Based on the information I received, I'm pleased to see that the budget continues to support our military men and women fighting in Iraq, Afghanistan, and elsewhere. The budget provides much-needed increases in several key areas, such as military personnel and missile defense. I'm also pleased that the Department is taking our nation's financial position into account and has identified savings from lower priority programs and efficiencies that can be reinvested into force structure and modernization. As chairman, I too am concerned that every dollar be invested in core missions of the Department. Now it will be up to us, the members of the Armed Services Committee, to take up this proposal and scrutinize it with a fine-tooth comb. We must ensure that every dollar is spent on the right equipment, training, and support needed by our troops, their families, and the nation's defense. Understandably, there will be winners and losers in this process. Tough choices must be made, but I will not support initiatives that will leave our military less capable and less ready to fight. In the request before us, most concerning is the reduction of an additional $78 billion from the Department's funding top line, including a $13 billion cut in 2012, ultimately leading to 0% real growth in the out years. Much of this savings appears to be generated with reductions to Army and Marine Corps end strength in the 2015 and to 2016 timeframe. The decision to reduce end strength seems premature given the uncertainty in predicting the full range of force and manpower requirements in Afghanistan after 2014. Furthermore, while some claim the reductions are not budget-driven, I note that the savings from these reductions were included in the future year's defense plan even before the Marine Corps completed its force structure review and before the Army had even begun one. Both services have borne the brunt of two wars for the past decade, and neither has reached its objectives for active component dwell time of 1 to 3. I cannot in good conscience ask them to do more with less. There are additional proposals that immediately warrant special scrutiny, like the Expeditionary Fighting Vehicle, for which an unfulfilled requirement remains. We must understand in greater detail how the Department proposes to address this capability gap before we can support abandoning a $4 billion investment we've already made. On a slightly different note, I'd be remiss if I did not acknowledge that the new Congress must finish work on defense appropriations legislation that was left unfinished in the 111th Congress. I have concerns about the implications to our troops of funding the Department of Defense at fiscal year 2010 funding levels in a year-long continuing resolution. Therefore, I'm pleased that the House has taken up a defense appropriation for fiscal year 2011 this week. While I'm disappointed there were not higher funding levels for defense in this legislation, I support all efforts by this Congress to avoid crippling the Department with a continuing resolution. I'd like to conclude by welcoming our witnesses, the Honorable Robert M. Gates, Secretary of Defense, and Admiral Michael G. Mullen, Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. I look forward to continuing an open dialogue with you on these issues. Now, if I'll turn to my colleague and good friend.
Here, and I want to begin by echoing the Chairman's last comment there about the need to pass a 2011 defense appropriations bill. You all have done an excellent job of explaining to us just how hamstrung you are by having to live with the CR for the last, I guess it's been almost 5 months now, the impact that has. And I would urge all members here to talk with folks at the Department of Defense to get a full understanding of just how that undermines our ability to carry out our national security requirements and how it even reaches over and potentially impacts what our troops are doing in Afghanistan and Iraq. Critical issue to get an appropriations bill done so we're not operating with a CR. And on this budget, I want to congratulate the Secretary and the Department of Defense for again making sure that they provide our troops with the equipment and the support they need to do the missions that we all have asked them to do. And compliments to this committee as well. Through the years, they have also stepped up to that task, particularly as the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan required much greater speed in meeting those needs. This budget, I think, again, reflects that top priority. Make sure our troops get the equipment and the support that they need. I also feel that this budget does a good job of trying to confront the budget realities that we are all aware of. It took a very hard and close look at the Department of Defense across the board to try to find savings and efficiencies. Less money. We absolutely can do that. And I think that's the most critical point that I want to make. Simply spending money doesn't make us safer. We have to make sure that that money is spent well and efficiently. And I don't think there is anyone who would disagree, looking back at the last 15 years and some of the decisions that have made, with the notion that we can do better, that we can get more for the money that we are spending, particularly when you look at the acquisition and the procurement process. And again, I want to compliment the Secretary of Defense and his team for really taking a hard look at some of the lessons that we've learned through systems like future combat systems, the F-35, other programs that have been more expensive than we would have liked. I think we've learned a lot, and I think we're moving forward in a very positive direction. And we also have to remember, as we look at this budget, two other important factors. The defense budget has grown enormously. 2001, in current dollars, it was $316 billion, went all the way up to $708. So we have had enormous growth, and we now need to figure out how to manage that. And we also need to be mindful of the fact that a strong national economy is critical also to our national security. An out-of-control deficit jeopardizes that economy. So we have to try to make sure that we can live within our means and do the job that we all have been asked to do. And I appreciate the hard work that has been done on that. I want to just add one specific comment before forward of stability operations and understanding sort of our broad national security interests. I think we've learned in Iraq and Afghanistan that development programs can be every little bit as important as military programs in creating a stable and secure environment that protects our interests. And I know the Secretary has spoken out strongly about the need not just to have a strong military, but also to have a strong State Department and a strong whole of government approach as we go forward and try to figure out some of these stability operations. So I appreciate your leadership on that and believe that those two will be important issues. And with that, I look forward to your testimony. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Before we begin, let me comment that we do have a full crowd here today, and I notice there are people out in the hallway that would like to be in here. So I would request that anyone who disrupts this hearing be removed by the Capitol Police. This includes outbursts and holding signs. This is a very important hearing, and the decorum should be maintained, and I would appreciate that be held that way. We'll have no, I have a very low tolerance level. Let me, Mr. Secretary and Admiral, Chairman, let me thank you to begin with for your many years of service, both of you, to the country. And we all appreciate greatly the efforts and the things that you're doing. I know that you're in a very, very tough job, and I just want to, at the outset, let you know how much every member of this committee appreciates your service to the nation. Mr. Secretary.
He doesn't get to talk very much anyway. Mr. Chairman, Mr. Smith, members of the committee, I'd like to start with a few words about Congresswoman Giffords, who of course should be with us today were it not for the tragic and senseless attack in Tucson last month. I've enjoyed working with Congresswoman Giffords in her capacity as a member of this committee. She is a strong supporter of the national defense and cares deeply about our troops and their families. And she has pursued her oversight responsibilities with dedication. Our thoughts and condolences continue to be with the families of the victims of that attack. We send our best to the Congresswoman's husband, Navy Captain Mark Kelly, for his upcoming space shuttle mission and as he helps Mrs. Giffords through her recovery. We will miss Representative Giffords' contributions today and in the weeks and months ahead, and we in the Department of Defense wish her a speedy and full rehabilitation. I appreciate the opportunity to appear before you to discuss the President's budget request for the Department of Defense for fiscal year 2012, my fifth and final budget testimony for the Department of Defense before this committee. I want to thank the members of this committee for your support of men and women in uniform serving in a time of war. I know you join me in doing everything to ensure that they have all they need to accomplish their mission and come home safely. The budget request for the Department of Defense today includes a base budget request of $553 billion and an overseas contingency operations request of $117.8 billion. These budget decisions took place in the context of a nearly two-year effort by this department to reduce overhead, cull troubled and excess programs, and rein in personnel and contractor costs, all for the purpose of preserving the global reach and fighting strength of America's military in a time of fiscal stress for our country. In all these budget requests, if enacted by the Congress, will continue our efforts to reform the way the Department does business, fund modernization programs needed to prepare for future conflicts, reaffirm and strengthen the nation's commitment to care for the all-volunteer force, and ensure that our troops and commanders on the front lines have the resources and support they need to accomplish their mission. My submitted statement includes more details of this request, but I want to take this opportunity to address several issues that I know have been a subject of debate and concern since I announced the outlines of our budget proposal last month. First, the serious damage our military will suffer by operating under a continuing resolution or receiving a significant funding cut during fiscal year 11. Second, the recommended termination of the extra engine for the Joint Strike Fighter. Third, the projected slowing and eventual flattening of the growth of the defense budget over the next 5 years. Fourth, the planned future reductions in the size of the ground forces. And fifth, the proposed reforms and savings to the TRICARE program for working-age retirees. I want to start by making it quite clear that the Department of Defense will face a crisis if we end up with a year-long continuing resolution or a significant funding cut for 2011. The President's defense budget request for 2011 was $549 billion. A full-year continuing resolution would fund the Department at about $526 billion. A cut of $23 billion. The damage done across the force from such reductions would be further magnified as they would come halfway through the fiscal year. Let me be clear. Operating under a year-long continuing resolution or significantly reduced funding with the severe shortfalls that entails would damage procurement and research programs, causing delays, rising costs, no new program starts, and serious disruptions in the production of some of our most high-demand assets, including UAVs. Cuts in maintenance could force parts of our aircraft fleet to be grounded and delay needed facilities improvements. Cuts in operations would mean fewer flying hours, fewer steaming days, and cutbacks in training for home-stationed forces, all of which directly impact readiness. Similarly, some of the appropriations proposals under debate in Congress contemplate reductions of up to $15 billion from the President's original FY11 request. I recognize that given the current fiscal and political environment, it is unlikely that the Defense Department will receive the full FY11 request. Based on a number of factors, including policy changes that led to lower personnel costs and reduced activity forced by the continuing resolution, I believe the Department can get by with a lower number. However, it is my judgment that the Department of Defense needs an appropriation of at least $540 billion for fiscal year 2011 for the U.S. military to properly carry out its mission, maintain readiness, and prepare for the future. At this point, I'd like to address the ongoing debate over the JSF extra engine. As most of you know, the President and I, and the previous President and his Secretary of Defense, as well as the Department's senior military leadership, have consistently and firmly expressed our opposition to continuing this costly program. We consider it an unnecessary and extravagant expense, particularly during a period of fiscal contraction. The Congress has not spoken with one voice on this matter, and the Department has been operating this fiscal year under ambiguous guidance at best. Under those circumstances, I decided to continue funding the JSF Extra Engine effort on a month-to-month basis. I did this not because we had to, but because we chose to give Congress the opportunity to resolve this matter as a part of its ongoing debate of the budget. However, this also means the American taxpayers are spending $28 million a month for an excess and unjustified program that is slated for termination. The President, the military services, and I continue to oppose this extra engine, and when the current CR expires, I will look at all available legal options to close down this program. It would be a waste of nearly $3 billion in a time of economic distress, and the money is needed for higher priority defense efforts. Which brings me to this proposed $78 billion reduction in the defense budget top line over the next 5 years. To begin with, this so-called cut is in fact to the rate of predicted growth. The size of the base defense budget is still projected to increase in real inflation-adjusted dollars before eventually flattening out over the next 5 years. More significantly, as a result of the efficiencies and reforms undertaken over the past year, we have protected programs that support military people, readiness, and modernization. These efforts have made it possible for the Department to absorb lower projected growth in the defense budget without, as Chairman McKeon warned last month, leaving our military less capable and less able to fight. In fact, the savings identified by the services have allowed our military to add some $70 billion toward priority needs and new capabilities. And of the $78 billion in proposed reductions to the 5-year defense budget plan, about $68 billion comes from a combination of shedding excess overhead, improving business practices, reducing personnel costs, and from changes to economic assumptions. So in reality, only $10 billion of that 5-year total is directly related to military combat capability. $4 billion of that 10 comes from restructuring the Joint Strike Fighter program, a step driven by this program's development and testing schedule that would have taken place irrespective of the budget top line. And so the rest, about $6 billion out of 78, results from the proposed decrease in the end strength of the Army and the Marine Corps starting in FY 2015. Just over 4 years ago, one of my first acts as Defense Secretary was to increase the permanent end strength of our ground forces, the Army by 65,000 for a total of 547,000, and the Marine Corps by 27,000 to 202,000. At the time, the increase was needed to relieve the severe stress on the force from the Iraq War as the surge was getting underway. To support the later plus-up of troops in Afghanistan, I subsequently authorized a temporary further increase in the Army of some 22,000, an increase always planned to end in FY 13. The objective was to reduce stress on the force, limit and eventually end the practice of stop-loss, and to increase troop home dwell time. As we end the U.S. presence in Iraq this year, according to our agreement with the Iraqi government, the overall deployment demands on our force are decreasing significantly. Just 3 years ago, we had 190,000 troops combined in Iraq and Afghanistan. By the end of this calendar year, we expect there to be less than 100,000 troops deployed in both of the major post-9/11 combat theaters, virtually all of those forces in Afghanistan. That is why we believe that beginning in FY 2015, the U.S. can, with minimal risk, begin reducing Army active duty end strength by 27,000 and the Marine Corps by somewhere between 15 and 20,000. These projections assume that the number of troops in Afghanistan will be significantly reduced by the end of 2014 in accordance with the President's and NATO's strategy. If our assumptions prove incorrect or world conditions change for the worse, there's plenty of time to adjust the size and schedule of this change. It is important to remember that even after the planned reductions, the active Army end strength would continue to be larger by nearly 40,000 soldiers than it was when I became Defense Secretary 4 years ago. I should also note that these reductions are supported by both the Army and Marine Corps leadership. Finally, as you know, sharply rising health care costs are consuming an ever larger share of this department's budget, growing from $19 billion in 2001 to $52.5 billion in this request. Among other reforms, this FY 12 budget includes modest increases to TRICARE enrollment fees, later indexed to Medicare premium increases for working-age retirees, most of whom are employed while receiving full pensions. All 6 members of the Joint Chiefs of Staff have strongly endorsed these and other cost-saving TRICARE reforms in a letter to Congress. I understand that any change to these kinds of benefits prompts vigorous political opposition. But let us be clear. The current TRICARE arrangement, one in which fees have not increased for 15 years, is simply unsustainable. And if allowed to continue, the Defense Department risks the fate of other corporate and government bureaucracies that were ultimately crippled by personnel costs, in particular their retiree benefit packages. All told, the cumulative effect of the Department's savings and reforms, combined with a host of new investments, will make it possible to protect the military's combat power despite the declining rate of growth and eventual flattening of the defense budget over the next 5 years. As a result of the savings identified and reinvested by the services, our military will be able to meet unforeseen expenses, refurbish war-worn equipment, buy new ships and fighters, begin development of a new long-range bomber, boost our cyber warfare capability, strengthen missile defense, and buy more of the most advanced UAVs. But I should note this will only be possible if the efficiencies, reforms, and savings are followed through to completion. In closing, I want to address the calls from some quarters for deeper cuts in defense spending to address this country's fiscal challenges. I would remind them that over the last 2 defense budgets submitted by President Obama, we have curtailed or canceled troubled or excess programs that would have cost more than $330 billion if seen through to completion. Additionally, total defense spending, including war costs, will decline further as the U.S. military withdraws from Iraq. We still live in a very dangerous and very unstable world. Our military must remain strong and agile enough to face a diverse range of threats, from non-state actors attempting to acquire and use weapons of mass destruction and sophisticated missiles, to the more traditional threats of other states, both building up their conventional forces and developing new capabilities that target our traditional strengths. We shrink from our global security responsibilities at our peril. Retrenchment brought about by short-sighted cuts could well lead to costlier and more tragic consequences later, indeed as they always have in the past. Surely we should learn from our national experience since World War I that drastic reductions in the size and strength of the U.S. military make armed conflict all the more likely, with an unacceptably high cost in American blood and treasure. Mr. Chairman, I look forward to working through this next phase of the President's defense reform effort with you in the weeks and months ahead to do what's right for our armed forces and to do what's right for our country. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Mr. Smith, and distinguished members of this committee. I'm honored to appear before you today to discuss the President's fiscal year 2012 defense budget. Before I do, however, let me echo Secretary Gates' comments about the very real dangers inherent in failing to pass this year's budget. The fiscal year 2011 continuing resolution, if carried forward, would not only reduce our account by $23 billion, it would deprive us of the flexibility we need to support our troops and their families. The services have already taken disruptive and, in some cases, irreversible steps to live within the confines of the CR, steps that ultimately make us less effective at what we're supposed to do for the nation. The Navy did not procure, as planned, a second Virginia-class submarine by the end of last month, nor was it able to buy government-furnished equipment for another Arleigh Burke-class destroyer. The Army and the Marine Corps have curtailed or altogether frozen civilian hiring. And all the services are now prevented from issuing contracts for new major military construction projects. Some programs may take years to recover if the CR is extended through the end of September. So I urge you to pass the fiscal year 11 defense bill immediately. Even at a reduced top line, it will provide us the tools we need to accomplish the bulk of the missions we have been assigned. Accomplishing those missions into the future demands as well support of the President's fiscal year 12 proposal. As the Secretary laid out, this budget, combined with the efficiencies effort he led, provides for the well-being of our troops and families, fully funds current operations in Afghanistan and Iraq, and helps balance global risk through streamlined organization, smarter acquisition, and prudent modernization. The Army, for instance, will cancel procurement of a surface-to-air missile and the non-line-of-sight launch system, but it will continue production of the Joint Light Tactical Vehicle and spearhead the development of a whole new family of armored vehicles. The Navy will give up its Second Fleet headquarters, reduce its manpower ashore, and increase its use of multi-year procurement for ships and aircraft, allowing it to continue development of the next generation ballistic missile submarine, purchase 40 new F-18s, 4 littoral combat ships, and another LPD-17. The Marines will cancel the Expeditionary Fighting Vehicle, and like the Army, reduce their end strength starting in 2015. But they will reinvest the EFV savings to sustain and modernize the amphibious assault vehicle and the light armored vehicle, even as they advance a new concept of operations and restore much of their naval expeditionary skills. And the Air Force will be able to continue development of the next tanker, a new bomber, and modernize its aging fleet of F-15 fighters, all the while finding savings of more than $33 billion through reorganization, consolidation, and reduced facilities requirements. None of this balancing will come on the backs of our deployed troops. We are asking for more than $84 billion for readiness and training, nearly $5 billion for increased ISR capabilities, and more than $10 billion to recapitalize our rotary aircraft fleet. These funds, plus those we are requesting to help build partner capacity in places like Afghanistan, Pakistan, Iraq, and Yemen, all speak to the emphasis we are placing on giving our troops and their partners in the field everything they need to do the difficult jobs we have asked of them. We must also give them and their families everything they need to cope with the stress and strain of 10 years at war. That's why I'm so pleased with the funds devoted to this in this proposal, almost 3/4 as much as the $200 billion budgeted for operations and maintenance, to personnel, housing, and health care issues. As you may know, the chiefs and I penned a rare 24-star letter to the Senate Armed Services Committee this week, expressing our unqualified support for the military health care program changes included in this budget. We sought equity across all health care programs, with beneficiaries and health care delivery providers having the same benefits as equivalent payment systems, regardless of where they live or work. That, in turn, led us to propose increases in TRICARE enrollment fees for working-age retirees. These increases are modest and manageable, and leave fees well below the inflation-adjusted out-of-pocket costs set in 1995 when the current fees were established. We sincerely hope you will see fit to pass them. Please know that we will continue to invest wisely in critical care areas to include research, diagnosis, and treatment of mental health issues and traumatic brain injury, enhanced access to health services, and new battlefield technologies. We understand that changes to health care benefits cause concern among the people we serve and the communities from which we receive care, but we also understand and hold sacred our obligation to care completely for those who have borne the brunt of these wars, as well as those for whom the war never ends. I'm convinced that we haven't even begun to understand the toll in dollars and in dreams that war extracts from people. As the grandsons and granddaughters of the World War II vets still struggle to comprehend the full scope of the horror those men yet conceal, so too will our grandchildren have to come to grips with the wounds unseen and the grief unspoken, unless, of course, we get it right. And I believe the investments we are making in wounded care and family readiness will pay off in that regard. But it will take time and patience and money, three things we seem so rarely to possess in this town. That brings me back to this particular budget request. With limited resources and 2 wars in progress, we should be prudent in defining our priorities, in slaking our thirst for more and better systems, and in controlling costs. We should also be clear about what the Joint Force can and cannot do, just as we should be clear about what we expect from our interagency and our international partners. Our global commitments have not shrunk. If anything, they have grown. and the world is a lot less predictable now than we could have ever imagined. You need look no further than Tahrir Square to see the truth in that. Foolhardy would it be for us to make hasty judgments about the benefits, tangible and intangible, that are about to be derived from forging strong military relationships overseas, such as the one we enjoy with Egypt. Changes to those relationships in either aid or assistance ought to be considered only with an abundance of caution and a thorough appreciation for the long view, rather than in the flush of public passion and the urgency to save a buck. The $1.3 billion we provide the Egyptian military each year has helped them become the capable professional force they are, and in that regard has been of incalculable value. Of equal or greater value is increased appropriations for the State Department. And our request in this budget for something called the Global Security Contingency Fund, a 3-year pooled fund between the Pentagon and State that will be used to build partner capacity, prevent conflicts, and prepare for emerging threats. The request is modest, an initial $50 million appropriation, along with a request for authority to reprogram an additional $450 million if needed. But what it will buy us is an agile and cost-effective way to better respond to unforeseen needs and take advantage of emerging opportunities for partners to secure their own territories and regions. We must get more efficient, yes, but we must also get more pragmatic about the world we live in. We can no longer afford bloated programs or unnecessary organizations without sacrificing fighting power. And we can no longer afford to put off investments in future capabilities or relationships that preserve that power across the spectrum of conflicts. I've long said we must not be exempt in the Defense Department from belt-tightening, but in truth, there is little discretionary about the security we provide our fellow citizens. Cuts can reasonably only go so far without hollowing the force. In my view, then, this proposed budget builds on the balance we started to achieve last year and represents the best of both fiscal responsibility and sound national security. Now, I don't know what sorts of questions Representative Giffords would ask me if she were sitting here today, but I do know she wouldn't let me leave until I lauded the incredible effort of our troops overseas as they finish one war in Iraq and begin to turn corners in Afghanistan. I know you share my pride in them and their families, and I know you will keep them foremost in mind as you consider the elements of this proposal. I thank you for your continued support of our men and women in uniform and their families, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much. Mr. Secretary, Mr. Chairman, as I stated earlier, I think everyone on this committee strongly supports your request for a appropriation bill that will take care of the work that should have been done last year. But if it had been done last year by the Congress and the administration, we wouldn't even be having this argument and this fight, the thing that we're trying to resolve right now on the floor. So I'm hopeful that we can wrap this up just as quickly as possible, and I know that all of the defense industry, all of the men and women who wear the uniform, and all of your colleagues in the department are strongly behind that, as are all of the members on the committee. So hope we can get that done quickly. The $78 billion that we're talking about as a cut, I understand that it's not a cut as we would have proposed something being cut this year from last year's budget. But last year, when we were holding these hearings and you projected out the budget for the 5 years, the $78 billion was included in it. Now, I commend you for what you've asked the services to do to find efficiencies and save that $100 billion that they'll be able to mostly reinvest into more important items going forward. And I guess we'll continue to talk about the outgoing years in outgoing years, but we all understand we're in a tough financial situation in the country, and I think we all need to work together to to make sure that whatever reductions in future spending, we all work together to make sure that it doesn't cut into our men and women in serving in harm's way and their families. One of the concerns I've had as we've gone through the QDR and hearings last year and this year, it seems to me that the budgets are not driven by so much defense needs or procurement, and the things that we're talking about spending aren't driven by threat needs. They're driven more by budgetary concerns. And as I indicated in my opening statement, reductions to the Army and Marine Corps end strength. I can remember when you came, Mr. Secretary, and how hard it was to increase the size of the force. And I understand that even with these reductions, there still will be a larger force than when you became Secretary 4 years ago. But as I look around the world and see what's happening, the recent events in Egypt and Yemen and Asia and other threats around the world, I have great concern about cutting the end strength. And so my question's revolving around that. Is the reduction in end strength conditions-based? If so, what metrics will the department use to reevaluate this decision going forward? At what point will we decide, and what measurement will we use to decide if this is the correct number to decrease our strength, and when will that decision be made? What was the 2016 end strength presumed by the QDR and during development of the National Military Strategy? And finally, how will this reduction in end strength affect the objective of 1 to 3 dwell time for the active force?
Let me start and then ask the chairman to add in. I would say that first of all, I would say that it is conditions-based. And as I said in my opening statement, if our assumptions about, for example, the drawdown in Iraq prove incorrect, then I think we'll be in a position to change this decision and add to end strength further. Well before 2015, or at least find other ways to deal with the dollars so that there isn't a reduction in end strength. I would say the key metric is, and the most predictable variable is in fact the drawdown in Afghanistan. A big assumption in this is that we have a very much smaller presence in Afghanistan at the end of 2014 than we do now, and I think you will know as early as the end of 2012, beginning of 2013, whether that's going to happen, which allows plenty of time to alter these decisions. The good thing about this approach is that because you don't start to cut anything until 2015, you don't have to go out and recruit anybody. All you have to do is find other sources of the money. And as was described to me a long time ago about the out years are where everybody's dreams come true. And so, just as an example, when I took this job, the projected budget for FY12 in the 07 Bush budget was $519 billion. Our submission is for $553. So these things do change over time, and there's a lot of flexibility. But I will say this about the Marine Corps. The Marine Corps actually came forward with their proposal, and it was really unrelated to the budget. Both the previous commandant and the current commandant believe that when the Marines are out of Afghanistan, that the Marine Corps is both too large and too heavy to fulfill its traditional missions going forward. And so they were talking about reductions in Marine Corps end strength a year or two ago. And so that they tie that very much to their mission. And as I say, we can revisit the Army's. You can revisit the Army's end strength depending on the conditions in 2013 or 14.
Mr. Chairman, all of us the leadership positions in the military believe that we live in a time of what we call persistent conflict. It's very difficult to know, obviously, what's going to happen in 2015, 2016 timeframe. But to your point, and to the Secretary's answer, I think this really is conditions-based per se. In addition to the metric of certainly Afghanistan and Iraq, and we will be in a position there in 2015, 2016, where our force is substantially reduced, and to include in that the 25,000 Marines or so who are there now. I would just echo what the Secretary said with Jim Conway, who was a previous Commandant Jim Amos, the current Commandant. They had been planning to get smaller and lighter. They're too heavy. They're the nation's second land force, which is not what they want to be, and they've got to get back to some degree as we move ahead to their roots, which is lighter and smaller. With respect to the Army in particular, we've looked out through the QDR at how many brigades would we have out there, and the answer is we're not sure. We've planned around 6 to 10 or some number like that. We don't know where, to look prudently at the future, as actually the Army has become much more expeditionary. And that's where we're headed, and I'm very comfortable with that. Each of the service chiefs, all of us, but each of the service chiefs, depending on which service you're talking about, some 60 to 70% when you add civilians, direct support contractors, 60 to 70% of our budget goes to people. And as the Secretary said in his statement, we are on our way of becoming almost immobilized by just what it costs in terms of our people. The healthcare piece is it's not an insignificant part of it, but it is an example. So we've tried to achieve balance. Probably the metric I would use is the one that you suggested, which is dwell time. We're now in this budget, as we look out a few years, we'll get to about in the 15 timeframe where we are 1 and 2. I think the Commandant would sit here and say that's probably about where he wants to be in terms of rotating his force. I think the Chief of the Army would say 1 and 3. And obviously that will then depend on what the obligations will be. But you can see now in various examples where we have our troops home a lot longer than we used to, starting to be significantly longer than they were deployed. We're just in the beginning of that. We've got to get out to 1 to 2, and in the case, look at really decisions around getting to 1 to 3 with respect to the Army. So I'm comfortable that we have time, we can look at it, and certainly the service chiefs would come in and change their recommendation, if you will, based on what I know about them, if the conditions warranted it.
Thank you very much, Ranking Member Smith.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Actually, I have 2 sets of questions. Congresswoman Gifford's staff has submitted to me some questions that she has, and I thank both of you for your kind words on her behalf. And they focus on Department of Defense energy issues, something that Congresswoman Giffords has worked a great deal on, and basically using efficiencies and alternatives to deal with our energy needs and reduce our energy consumption. She had introduced a bill, the Department of Defense Energy Security Act in 2010. Many of those provisions were contained in our FY 2011 NDAA, and wanted to follow up on that. And specifically, there's a program that the Marine Corps is using at a forward operating base in Afghanistan to use solar as a way to reduce their fuel consumption. And I think the biggest point here to make is this isn't just about saving money or dealing with the energy challenges. This also does save lives. And the specific example there is that because they used solar, they were able to significantly reduce their fuel consumption, as I understand it, from like 20 gallons a day down to 2.5. And that reduction means that fewer convoys have to come and go and bring fuel in, which means fewer people are exposed to the IED threat. So there are very specific implications of this policy. And going forward, want to know, first of all, how the Department of Defense is doing implementing these programs, finding efficiencies, reducing our energy consumption through the use of efficiencies and alternatives. And then second of all, what more we in Congress legislatively need to do or can do to help you. And if you could, on those 2 questions, I'd like to hear some brief comments from you, but submit the answers for the record to both Congresswoman Gifford's office and to mine. But if you could take a stab at that now, that'd be great.
I think the example that you actually give with the Marines in Afghanistan is a terrific example, and it does exactly what you just described. And actually, the Marines in Anbar province several years ago started that, looking at the length of their convoys, the number of people that were actually put in harm's way because of the logistics and transportation requirements. That has kicked in over to the Army and actually across all the services. I mean, so I think the efforts with respect to improving and reducing energy dependency are significant. The Secretary stood up a very, very strong office to oversee this, to both integrate the efforts. The investments are there. The Air Force has, from my perspective, led the way with respect to synthetic fuel, use of synthetic fuels in aircraft. The Navy has picked up on that. So there is a significant effort across the board. There are green investments taking place in the Marine Corps out in 29 Palms, for instance, just straight solar energy. The reductions that base commander are seeing are significant as well. That is also starting to be put in place in other bases around the country. So we're sharing the ideas. We know that we've got to reduce our dependence significantly, and the leaders are focused on that. We've seen some of the results, but we have expectations they'll be significantly greater in the future.
Yeah, and I think Mr. Secretary, go ahead. Sorry.
I'm just going to make two quick comments. First, I think credit needs to be given particularly to the Secretary of the Navy, Ray Mabus, because I think the Navy has a really aggressive program in terms of reducing energy use. Second, I would just note that I read just a few days ago that the C-17 was just certified for the use of synthetic fuels.
Yeah. And that's why 2 points, just closing on this issue before I ask another question, is number one, how much a difference this can make. I think there's generally in the energy field a feel like, well, yeah, they're talking about this and that and the other thing, but when's it ever going to happen? It's happening. And I think the military is out front. Every base that I visit, and there are many, always talk about they're doing this, that, or the other thing on energy and how much they've reduced their energy consumption, how much more efficient it is. And then I think the challenge really is to get it to scale. Is as all these experiments are happening, sort of quickly find out, okay, here are the three things that just work the best. Let's get them service-wide and get them implemented. So I think you're making enormous progress there. We thank you in that. And like I said, if you could submit a more detailed answer to Congressman Gifford's office in mine, that would be great. I appreciate it. Just two quick areas I want to ask about. One, as I mentioned in my opening remarks, development assistance is becoming a greater part of our national security. Stability is the goal here. Our enemies now prey on ungoverned or ungovernable spaces. They find openings, places. It certainly happened in Afghanistan. It's happening in Pakistan, and Somalia, and Yemen to some extent. So figuring out how to do stability is going to be critical. And I know of necessity, the Department of Defense has taken on a lot of responsibility in this area through SERP funds, through 1206, 1208. And part of the problem there is these are responsibilities better done by, in some cases, the State Department or Department of Agriculture or other areas that know more about those. But you guys have the money, and you've got, you were the forward-leading folks. You were out there in the field having to figure this out. And, frankly, there was not sufficient support elsewhere, so you had to do it. The question is, how do we begin to transition that responsibility? Because it's not a core responsibility of the military in many instances. It is a core responsibility of folks in other agencies. But how do you make that work? How do we make sure those other agencies have the support they need? How do we transfer the funds? How do you envision that playing out?
Well, we've been advocating for much greater civilian involvement in these kinds of activities, not only in Iraq and Afghanistan, but in global stability operations, at least since I gave the Landon Lecture at Kansas State in 2007. The biggest part of the problem, quite frankly, is jurisdictions here on the Hill. And it is the difficulty the State Department has in getting their appropriations and getting the money they need to do their job. If you took every Foreign Service officer in the State Department, you would not have a large enough number to crew a single aircraft carrier. So finding the resources for the State Department, because many of these areas, what we have done is work with you, and you have been very helpful to us in developing some workarounds. So on 1206, for example, we have dual key arrangements. we basically leave the initiative up to the State Department in terms of what we should do on some of those, and then we fund it and we partner with them. By rights, that money should probably be in the State Department to start with. And so I think this is an area where legislation, but especially appropriations, are really important, because these stability operations, and there is a military component to it, because it is developing partner security capabilities so that they can take care of the security in their own countries, so we don't have to send American troops to do it. And you can just tell from the costs in Iraq and Afghanistan the differential in cost between our training somebody else to do it and the State Department then providing the civilian support in terms of governance and various other kinds of assistance, compared with having to use U.S. troops. So it's a challenge. I think we have developed over the last several years very close working relationships between state and defense in these workarounds, in these jerry-rigged operations, but a long-term solution is the kind of global fund that
Right.
Admiral Mullen was talking about, and so on.
Thank you, and you're absolutely right. I mean, security has to be a key component of any sort of development going forward. You don't have security, you can't do that. And I think the Philippines is an excellent example of where a very small number of our forces train the local security forces. And you don't hear much about what's going on in the Philippines, and that's a good thing. And then you look at Iraq and Afghanistan, and you can see that the alternative is just so much more costly. It's beyond imagination. Just one final comment: when we're trying to figure out going forward, dealing with the difficult budget environment that we have, and trying to anticipate threats, trying to make sure that we're ready for whatever comes next. I just want to make sure that the people are aware of the fact that you cannot be ready for everything. From my earliest days in this committee, one of the things that struck me was, every day we come and we talk about some threat, and then we talk about how we're not doing enough to be ready for it. And I get that. But if you were to look out at the world and imagine every possible threat, and say that the job of this committee, or your job, is to make sure that we spend enough money to be ready for any and all contingencies. The defense budget, well, it might not be infinite, but it would be darn close. So we have to prioritize those threats going forward with the budget. And we can't walk too far down the road that if we can imagine a threat, we have to spend whatever we possibly can to make sure that we're protected against it, because that sinks us in a different way. We really have to prioritize, and towards that end, I think that the key going forward to get the right budget is to really look at the requirements. I mean, it starts with the QDR. It starts with once we decide that there is a requirement, we then have to fund it. And if we don't fund it, we are not giving our troops the support that they need to do the job that we, by definition, have asked them to do. But I'd like to think that we can also go back to the start of that process, not just the end and say, gosh, we have to fund this, but go back to the start and say, well, is that really a requirement? Or was that something we developed 10 or 15 years ago that's no longer appropriate? So getting there, I think we need to move in that direction.
Let me make just two quick comments about that. First of all, if you look back to every time we have engaged in a military operation since the Vietnam War, we have a perfect record. 6 months to a year before we engaged in that operation, nobody had any idea we were going to do it. And so the mantra for the department that I've tried to inculcate is, in the budget environments, we have to be exceptionally careful about buying niche capabilities, very expensive weapon systems that have application in only one scenario. There may be some of those that we need, but we need to be extremely judicious about those investments. But our overall approach ought to be the broadest, the most flexible range of capabilities to cover the broadest range of conflict, so that a C-17 is going to be applicable whether we're dealing with a near peer or whether we're taking aid into Pakistan. So having capabilities that can perform many missions is where we need to focus most of our procurement dollars, for the very reason you cited.
Sir, can I just make one comment? I think one of the ways you do protect against the unknowns is to make sure that your S&T and what I would call pure R&D budgets are both comprehensive and broad, and not and sometimes those become very easy targets. You need the innovation, you need the kind of investment for the capabilities of the future that really starts there. And the Secretary has led this. There has been a very focused effort to make sure that that is sustained. And in the totality of the budget, it's not a huge amount of money, but its long-term leverage is just almost off the charts.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thanks, both witnesses. You're doing an outstanding job for our country. We appreciate it.
Thank you, Mr. Bartlett.
Thank you. Mr. Secretary, I want to put my comments in context. To the best of my knowledge, the only interest in the engine for the F-35 in the district I have the honor to represent is an interest in the 135. As far as I know, there is no interest in the 136. The Weapons Systems Acquisition Reform Act of 2009 requires that you ensure that the acquisition strategy for each major defense acquisition program includes measures to ensure competition or the option of competition at both the prime contract level and the subcontract level of such program throughout the life cycle of such program as a means to improve contractor performance. The current F-35 acquisition strategy states, and I quote, "To preclude excessive reliance on a single engine supplier, an alternative engine program was established," unquote. The F-35 could represent up to 95% of the entire U.S. fighter fleet in the future. Use of a single engine could result in grounding of essentially all of the fighters in all of the services. The 2010 Hadley-Perry Quadrennial Defense Review Panel endorsed dual procurement competition, and I quote, "as the only way to control program costs." The senior Pentagon procurement official cited competition as the cornerstone of defense acquisition. The Pentagon's last update of the F-35 alternative engine business case indicated the competitive engine is at the break-even point in net present value. After having opposed dual-source procurement for the littoral combat ship as not being, quote, "real competition," unquote, the Pentagon signed a dual-source procurement contract at the end of last year with the two bidders for the LCS. Sir, for the past 2 days, 2 papers have been circulated to the Congress here. One of them on Monday, one of them on Tuesday. They are unsigned and undated. It simply says prepared by the Department of Defense. The Office of the Secretary of Defense for Legislative Affairs has refused to respond over the past 3 days to why these papers are not dated or why they were not provided to the Armed Services Committee. Sir, when I was a little boy, my mother impressed on me that an intent to deceive was the same thing as a lie. In each of these papers, there is a statement. The F-136 alternate engine is currently 3 to 4 years behind in development compared to the current engine program. And yesterday's paper said, and the F-136 engine is already 3 to 4 years behind in its development phase. Sir, the second engine, was started 4 years after the first engine. As you know, the first engine is now about 24 months behind in its development. I understand that the second engine is just 2 to 3 months behind in its development cycle. So in reality, had they both been started at the same time, the second engine would now be well ahead of the first engine. Sir, are you comfortable that these 2 missiles that have been gone through the Congress for the last couple of days do not constitute a violation of the statute that prohibits the Pentagon from lobbying the Congress?
I'm not in the slightest aware of either one of those documents. The only document that I'm aware of is the letter that I sent to Representative Rooney, I think, yesterday or the day before, and I can assure you it was both signed and dated. I will just tell you, well, that was your question.
Sir, these 2 papers are circulated. I will have them bring copies down to you. They are unsigned and undated, and the Office of the Secretary of Defense for Legislative Affairs refused to respond over the last 3 days as to why these papers are not signed or why they were not provided. They provided to everybody else in the Congress except the Armed Services Committee, is my understanding. Are you comfortable, sir, that this does not constitute a violation of the statute that says that the Pentagon cannot lobby Congress?
Well, let me see the papers and find out the background before I make a judgment on them.
Thank you, and we will, we would, after you have a chance to peruse those, if you would please respond to the gentleman in writing, we'd appreciate that. Mr. Reyes.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Gentlemen, welcome, and thank you for your service. Let me add my concern to the issue of the reductions in strength for both the Army and the Marines, given some of the challenges that we know we're going to have in the next few years in the Horn of Africa and other areas. So I do hope we're careful with those reductions, because in the final analysis, the ones that pay the price are the servicemen and women and their families. In most recently, we've learned over the last 8 years that in activating and using the reserve forces, a lot of unintended negative consequences impacted those families. So I also want to urge caution there. The other concern that I have is yesterday it became a national story about a lawsuit filed by former veteran women that are alleging what I think is a hostile work environment and sexual harassment and other things. I know you're probably not in a position to comment on that, Mr. Secretary, but I would like to work with your office to better understand exactly the circumstances that led to this lawsuit.
Well, if I may, let me just say, and obviously what I can say is limited by the fact of the lawsuit, but let me just say a couple of things, because this is a matter of grave concern, I suspect, to everybody in the room. First of all, I have zero tolerance for sexual assault, and I've worked with Chairman Mullen and the Joint Chiefs and the service secretaries to see if we're doing all we can to prevent and respond to sexual assaults. I've had multiple meetings with the senior leadership of the department on this issue over the past 4 years, established 4 critical areas of departmental focus: reducing stigma associated with reporting, ensuring sufficient commander training, ensuring investigator training and resources, and ensuring trial counsel training and resourcing. We've hired dozens more investigators, field instructors, prosecutors, and lab examiners. We've spent close to $2 million over the last 2 years to train our prosecutors so that they're better able to be successful. We have expanded the sexual assault response coordinator and victim advocates tenfold, from 300 to 3,000, and we now have those advocates at every base and installation in the world, including in Iraq and Afghanistan. The court-martial percentages have increased from about 30% to 52%. So we are making headway. The fact is we aren't where we should be. It is a matter of grave concern, and we will keep working at it.
Yes.
Sir, I would certainly more than just echo what the Secretary said in terms of zero tolerance. This has been an issue, actually, over the course of the last 6 or 7 years. It has been an issue of great focus, and it is unacceptable that we haven't gotten where we need to be on this. We know this is an extraordinarily difficult issue, and I know, both as a former service chief as well as knowing the current service chiefs, it's an area of focus. It wasn't that long ago. It was a significant area both in the combat zone, in Iraq. There still is enough anecdotal information coming out of both Iraq and particularly in Afghanistan to certainly be of concern. What the Secretary said in terms of the investments, in terms of improvements in education, focus on leadership, is exactly right. But we also have, I think, we still have significant work to do, and the leadership is focused on that.
Thank you. Let me just mention quickly 2 other things. First of all, I represent Fort Bliss, who in the area of green energy is hoping to be off the grid by the 2015-2016 timeframe. That's a huge compliment to the work that you're both supporting in terms of alternative energy. And then the last thing is I would urge you, Mr. Secretary, to work closely with the Secretary of Veterans Affairs to find a way to computerize as servicemen and women come out of active duty into the Veterans Administration jurisdiction, that there be a way of doing a better job through automation. Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Mr. Thornberry.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ms. Secretary, I thought that the sentence you have towards the close of your statement was that retrenchment brought about by short-sighted cuts could well lead to costlier and more tragic consequences later, indeed, as they always have in the past, is a very powerful statement to me. I think it's a warning to all of us, somewhat related to the conversation you were having with Mr. Smith about 6 months out, we never know what we're about to get into. And I guess it's that feeling that really you expressed better than I could that leads me to be concerned about not just end strength, but force structure in the future. I noticed that the independent panel of the QDR, chaired by Steve Hadley and former Secretary Perry, with all these people you know well on it, expressed their concern about a growing gap between our interests and our military capability to protect those interests in a complex, challenging security environment. That's along the very same lines you were talking about with our diverse, complicated, difficult threats, and their conclusion was that they believe the current size and current end strengths of the Army and Marine Corps should be retained. And I heard what both of you said, that this is conditions-based, and we'll see how it goes, and we can change our mind. But I'm under the impression that the end strength and force structure is not something that you can just flip a switch and say on-off, that it's the kind of thing that you got to plan ahead for, both in budgets, in equipment, in the personnel pipeline for training. It's something that has to be planned for. And so I guess I would appreciate a little more of, especially since this is, you say, your last appearance before us, a little more of your thoughts about not just end strength, but the force structure moving ahead with the kinds of threats that at least we understand are on the horizon: failed states, trouble in the Middle East, the kinds of stability operations that y'all were talking about from a financial standpoint, but all of that is very manpower intensive. And so I would appreciate your thoughts about how we on this committee can best prepare us to deal with those kinds of challenges ahead, even if we don't know exactly what they are.
Well, first of all, as I look ahead, I think, as I say, and as both the chairman and I have said, the end strength that I approved in 2007 for both services will remain in place at least until 2015, and could be, those plans could be altered depending on circumstances. As I look around the world, and we were talking about stability operations, one of the areas that where we have had a significant expansion of capabilities over the last few years has been in our special operations forces, and they often play the training role that Mr. Smith was talking about in these stability operations. And one of the big moves we've made that's not been noticed very much is that this increase in soft capabilities over the last 2 or 3 years has been moved out of the supplementals and into the base budget, so that those soft capabilities that we will use in a lot of these unstable conditions that we look around the world and see will be sustained even once we stop getting overseas contingency appropriations and so on. I will tell you the areas of force structure that worry me a lot, and they are areas that this committee in the years to come is going to have to address. For example, the number of our surface ships. a number of the Navy ships that were built during the Reagan years will basically reach the end of their planned life in the 2020s. And where the money comes from to replace those surface ships or to get to 313, which is the Navy's goal from the 287 we have now, I think is going to be a challenge, and especially if you put it alongside for the Navy acquiring a new ballistic missile submarine. For the Air Force, is the Air Force, in fact, in 2020 or 2025, going to be able to afford a new tanker, an F-35, and a new penetrating bomber? So there are some tough choices in terms of big capabilities that are coming down the road. They're not facing us right now, and what we have been able to do is to give future Congresses and future presidents choices, because we are making investments in things like the SSBNX, like the new bomber, and so on. But down the road, when procurement starts, there are going to be some very tough decisions that are going to have to be made.
Thank you. Ms. Sanchez.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Admiral and Secretary, for being before us again today. And Secretary Gates, I just would like to thank you for your service, because you've obviously serving under two presidents just have been really wonderful to work with. And I think so many of us here who have been on this committee for a long time really appreciate your candor and your desire and to work with us to make things better at the Pentagon. So thank you for that. You know, we find ourselves in two wars, and it's been, I don't know, I'm losing track, maybe about 8 years. And when you're in a time of war, there's always the, fog of war, and you want to fund, you want to make sure you win, you want to make sure your soldiers and airmen and seamen and Marines and Coast Guard and all are taken care of and have what they need when they're on the front line. And so I think what we've seen is really an increase in monies, at least over the 14 years, now 15 years that I've been on this committee. But, just in January, the Department of Defense came out with the report stating that in the past 3 years, the Pentagon had awarded $285 billion to companies that were defrauding the Pentagon. $285 billion in 3 years. And I know when I look through your budgets, and I've talked to you and we've worked through, that you are taking extensive initiatives to bring efficiency and savings to the department. And I know we set up the task force with Mr. Andrews on this committee to do acquisition in a different manner, and we believe that we will find some of this fraud, and we will contract in a different way, and we will begin to see some savings from that. But when something like $285 billion over 3 years occurs, it really is working against all the hard work that you and others and some on this Congress have done in terms of getting rid of the waste in the department. And what really concerns me is that Senator Sanders requested that investigation. If he had not, we'd have never seen that $285 billion report. So my question is, what's in place for the Department of Defense to catch those types of things? Were they not in place, or do we have new guidelines now that we've seen that came forward? And what can you do, and what can we do together to ensure that these types of companies never get a contract again from the federal government?
Well, I'm not familiar with the study that you cite, but I will tell you that there have been a number of changes made over the last year or so in terms of our approach to acquisition, beginning with the legislation that the Congress passed on acquisition reform. The one exception that I have made to the freeze on civilian hiring for the next 5 years in the department is in fact in the acquisition area and in hiring professional, building up our own professional cadre of acquisition experts. Part of the reason for that is we've had too many instances where we have contractors letting contracts to contractors instead of people who have the interests of the Department of Defense and the U.S. taxpayer at heart. So professionalizing our acquisition workforce is a very high priority. We have really changed a lot in the last year or so in terms of our procedures and our processes. First of all, just in negotiating smarter contracts. And we have seen some real benefits from that, and the example was used in another context of the littoral combat ship. Being able to get these two into a real competition got the price down far enough that we were able to actually buy more ships because of that. So I think we have a lot of efforts underway. We have thousands of auditors. I have about 10,000 lawyers. And so the key is, I think, having the acquisition professionals who can discern these bad behaviors and first of all, prevent them from happening in the first place, but then be quicker and more effective in catching them.
Thank you. My time is over. We'll make sure we get that Department of Defense report to you so you can take a look at that. And I have some other questions, but I'll submit them for the record and because of the time. Thank you, Mr. Secretary.
Thank you, Mr. Aiken.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. I want to start by saying I really respect your decisiveness. Nobody could say that you're afraid to wade in and make the tough decisions, and certainly we need that kind of leadership. I don't always appreciate the communication strategy of letting us know. You say that sometimes you don't know for 6 months before whether you're going to be into a conflict. Sometimes we don't know whether a program's going or not, and it's a matter of about a day or so that we find out. So sometimes in this committee it would be helpful if you work on the communications and give some of us a heads up as to what you're thinking and where we're going, because we're trying to play as a team with you. Particularly in that regard, I've shifted over. I'm now on the Budget Committee and trying to help people to understand the difference in growth of entitlements and what's happened to the defense budget as a percent of GDP. As you know, the defense budget's gone very much down since 1965, and entitlements are whatever it is, 600 or 700% increased. But we need to make the case to make sure that you're not so pinched on money that you can't get the job done. So I hope that you look at us as partners and helpers and things. So if you're going to all of a sudden, for instance, going to whack the expeditionary fighting vehicle, which happens to be in our committee, it'd be helpful to have some idea that you're thinking about that. As we move from full speed ahead to all stop, you know, it's a little helpful to have a heads up on it. I was interested to hear you reflect on where you were concerned about where we are overall. I also am concerned about the number of ships. I had a chance to spend 3 hours in one of those situation rooms that was designed to give us a picture from Hail Britannia, you know, ruler of the seas, and all through our history. And one of the big lessons from that was you fight the war with the ships that you have, or at least the ones you had on the ways. You can't design a new ship and build it until the war will be over by the time you get there. My concern was we were talking about a 313 ship Navy. We're down to 287, and as you point out, when you put the ballistic missile submarine or something in there, boy, that budget just blows up. So I certainly hope we can work on whatever we can do to try to continue on the building. The other thing, the expeditionary fighting vehicle, I don't really give a rip what particular platforms we have, but it seems to be non-negotiable that Marines have to get from the ocean to the land, and they've got to get there quick enough and not seasick enough and not full of diesel fumes enough that they can actually fight when they get to shore. And I'm not convinced that we have an adequate strategy without having that vehicle or something to fill that gap. So it's something we're going to take a look at, but I hope that you'd at least allow us to go through that and be flexible with us in saying, if we don't have a good strategy, let's make sure we have a good one, because I think the Brits decided they weren't going to do that capability, and then they got in the Falkland Island War and just about lost it because they hadn't planned to be able to get their Marines on the shore. So just wanted to allow you to respond to my rambling here a little bit, but we want to work with a team, that's my main point, with you, but we need a little bit of heads up before you make your decisive moves. Thank you, sir.
Well, first of all, on the EFV, let me just say publicly and for the record, the Department of Defense totally supports the Marine Corps in a firm requirement for an amphibious assault capability for the Marines. We just don't want to spend $15 billion, which is virtually all of the Marine Corps' ground vehicle procurement budget, for enough vehicles to take 4,000 out of 202,000 Marines from ship to shore. Now, I think the Commandant, and it should be clear, this was a recommendation from the Commandant to the Secretary of the Navy and from them to me. And I think we should also understand the Commandant does have an alternative plan in terms of first accelerating the Marine personnel carrier, second upgrading part of the existing amphibious assault vehicle fleet, and then third, designing a new amphibious assault vehicle, but one without the expensive, exquisite capabilities of the EFV. So there is a commitment to this, and there is money in the FY12 budget to begin pursuing this. And with respect to your first observation, I would just say that, first of all, I think that most of the members of this committee believe that I have been pretty honest, pretty forthcoming, and candid and transparent ever since taking this job. And I fully recognize the constitutional role of the Congress with respect to our military forces. And in fact, in my first commencement address at the Naval Academy, spoke to the midshipmen about that very fact and the importance of Congress and for them to stay apolitical, among other things. But at the same time, I have to have a disciplined decision process inside the Department of Defense. And to tell you the truth, until a few years ago, the place leaked like a sieve. And I couldn't make an internal decision without it being in the newspapers or that process being in the newspapers. And so I have tried to instill some discipline in the department. And the truth is that by going out on January 6th with what we have in mind for the FY12 budget, this committee and its counterpart in the Senate got a 6 weeks head start in evaluating the FY12 budget over every other committee in the Congress and every other part of the President's budget, and I got the President's approval to go ahead and do that. The same thing happened in the spring of 2009 when I came up. I made a lot of decisions in the spring of 2009 on programs. 33 of them came up here. All the major ones. And in every single one of those, the Congress had an opportunity to evaluate it and decide whether to go forward or not. Right now, 32 of the 33 are in law. So I think that I absolutely agree with you. We need to do this as a team. But I also have to have a disciplined decision process inside the Department of Defense so that I can get everybody's point of view. People can speak up in meetings, can disagree, and we can work things out before making a decision.
Thank you, Mr.
Mr. Andrews.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, gentlemen, for your service. The highest compliment I can pay you is that you reflect the same level of excellence, the men and women that you lead. And we appreciate all three of your service to our country. I apologize for not being personally present during your testimony, but I have read it. And, Mr. Secretary, I wanted to direct your attention to page 4 of your written testimony, which goes into a list of the savings that you are proposing. First of all, let me thank you for proposing them. I think too often the debate here has been trivialized by people who I think incorrectly say our military budget's just too large because it looks too large without being able to talk about the needs the country has. And then others who would look at any reduction as somehow a threat to national security without real and fair analysis. I can't think of a person better suited to lead us to a mature discussion of this than you, and I thank you for taking that leadership role. I want to ask you a couple of questions. You talk about $11 billion over the, I guess, 5-year window from resetting missions, priorities, functions for defense agencies and OSD. What does that mean more specifically?
Let me answer and then quickly, and then ask Mr. Hale to elaborate. What we have asked every defense agency and every part of the Office of the Secretary of Defense to do is to what we call re-baseline their activities. To start with a clean sheet of paper, what are you doing, what should you be doing, and how many people does it take to do that? And so this is one of the areas in which we are able to shed staff contractors, in which we are able to reduce the number of people that are working in these areas. We're consolidating some activities. We are eliminating other activities. And so it really has to do on the civilian side of the department. How do we make the defense agencies and OSD itself more efficient and find savings? And so that's the basic umbrella.
If I may, this goes to your premise of your earlier arguments, which I understand as being finding ways to make more efficient what we do in our logistical operations so that we can become more effective in our actual defense activities. Is that a fair summary of what you're trying to do?
Yes, sir. And the defense agencies have a lot of people and a lot of money, and they've grown a lot over the last decade. And frankly, we thought that it was time to take a fresh look at all of this, and I think it's been a long time since anybody's really gone into this in the way we have.
Did you, because I am one who would be eager to try to work with you to find more savings in these and other areas, and I think you'll find that there are members of both parties willing to do that. So,
I think there are two areas where we have not realized the opportunities that we have. After all, we came up with $178 billion worth of structural changes, overhead changes, economic changes in the space of about 6 or 8 months. And I think there are two areas, for example, where I think we have the opportunity to save a great deal more money. One is in acquisitions, which we've just been talking about.
Yes, sir.
But in negotiating smarter, better contracts, and we've seen this already on the SSBNX, on the LCS, on several different programs, space satellites. The other, though, is in information technology, and we got to start on that in this effort, but it's just complex enough that we haven't gotten as far as we would like. But I think those are just two areas where we could do a lot more.
Many of us, Mr. Secretary, are eager to be your partner in that effort. I want to thank Secretary Hale in particular for being very accessible and very precise whenever we need to speak to him. Let me say one thing that I would leave you with, that I would take some personal responsibility for and hope that some of our colleagues would. You have $1 billion for eliminating unnecessary studies and internal reports. A lot of them emanate from us. And there is a tendency when we want to try to change the law to settle for, well, we'll just put a provision and ask the Pentagon to do a report. And I, as someone who's violated that rule myself, I'd be willing to try to not do that in the future and try to urge our colleagues to do the same thing.
We'll give you some ammunition. From now on, all reports, whether they're internally commissioned or externally commissioned, will on the front page have what it costs to prepare the report.
You should also put the name of the person who asked for it. Thank you, Mr. Secretary.
Thank you, Mr. Forbes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And Mr. Secretary, thank you for being here today. And I want to just say how much we respect your office, and I hope that you won't conclude that it's disrespectful if we try to get your answers concise enough to fit into the 5 minutes we have, but it's just oftentimes so difficult for many of us, at least on this side, to get information from the Department of Defense. One of the things that we saw on January the 26th, when your Deputy Secretary, Mr. Lynn, was here, he testified that the department had failed to comply with the law requiring audited financial statements be filed annually in the years 2007, 2008, 2009, 2010, all years, of course, that you were Secretary of Defense. And my first question is, for any of those years, 2007, 8, 9, or 10, were you unaware that the law required that DOD file audited financial statements?
I certainly was not aware that we were in violation of the law.
So you did not know that you were in violation of law. The second question, Mr. Lynn further testified that no such statements would be filed this year, but he said that it was a priority of the Department of Defense that you get in compliance and that you had a plan to do it. Has that always been a priority of yours since you've been Secretary of Defense?
Yes, it has, and in fact, I think if you go back to testimony 4 years ago, the person who had the job before Mr. Hale had begun the planning and execution of getting us to a position where we could comply with the CFO law.
Mr. Secretary, if I could, I don't know if we have an opportunity to put it up on the screen, but hopefully we will, and on the monitors. But if not, there's a chart right over here, and there it is going, but it might be hard to see, but you can see this screen over here, and I'm wondering if you recognize that website at all. And the reason I say it, just to refresh your memory, there's a copy over here, and I know it's hard to see, but this is your website, and this is live. This is not something on the screen that we made a copy of. This is what you would have seen at that testimony you're talking about in 2007, or if we'd have done it in 2008, 2009, 2010, or if anybody were to go to it today, and it says this website's designed to provide all the information you need to understand the budget and financial management policy of the Department of Defense. And Mr. Secretary, what it clearly states on there, if we'd had that testimony then, is that the Department of Defense would have been in 100% compliance and given 100% audited financial statements by the year 2010. But in point of fact, according to what Mr. Lynn testified, the department was off 100%. Is that not accurate, in that we've filed no audited financial statements?
Well, we certainly have not filed clean audits, that's for sure.
And Mr. Secretary, a question I'd have for you is, would you authorize, you've been given by taxpayers of this country $2.5 trillion essentially since you've been Secretary of Defense. Would you authorize the expenditures of these sums if you were not convinced there were adequate accounting systems in place to know where they were being spent?
Mr. Forbes, I am confident that we have the financial processes, all of which were, by the way, designed for budgetary planning and which the Congress has relied on for a long time, that give me confidence that we know where the money is going. Can we do the kind of audits that are required by the CFO? No. But we are spending between $200 and $300 million a year to get in compliance. We have a short-term and a long-term plan to get there, which I would be happy to share with the committee. So we understand our obligation to get to this, but the reality is we do have systems in place to deal with fraud, to deal with other issues, and that provide us with the tools to do financial management and
Mr.
budgeting.
Secretary, I don't want to cut you off, but I only have about 40 seconds left. And the reality is this: we were 100% off. And I want to be kind and I want to be respectful, but the reality is that taxpayers have entrusted your department with $2.5 trillion, and here's the way we basically repay them with the accounting. You call it discipline and decision-making, but we've issued gag orders to stop people from the Pentagon and talking to members about Congress about where those dollars are. Didn't get a shipbuilding plan in the year it was required by law. Didn't get the aviation plan in the year it was required by law. Haven't had the audited financial statements required by law. And the cuts that you give us, Mr. Secretary, we only get backfilled information. And Mr. Chairman, I know my time is up, and so I'll yield back.
Thank you very much. Mrs. Davis.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and Secretary Gates and Chairman Mullen. I think we all applaud you for your extraordinary service, and I certainly want to add my voice as well. Since you said, Secretary Gates, that this is your last budget, I believe also, Chairman Mullen? Is it your last budget as well?
As far as I know.
Given that, several of my colleagues have asked some questions, I think, that have asked you to kind of take out of from your notes. And what is it that concerns you the most, whether it's in the budget or outside the budget? And I wonder if you could speak just a bit to any disconnect that you see between what the needs are and what the budget actually reflects. it's a little of the what keeps you up at night question, but I would hope that as this is your final, if there's anything in particular that you'd like to focus our attention on that may
Well,
not have been stated.
I'll take a crack at it. You know, as I look at the future, there's been a discussion today about force structure, and I worry in the longer run. I think we're okay right now, but I worry in the longer run that we align our force structure with the national security requirements we have as a country. And at some point in time, with the force structure we have, we're going to have to start saying there's going to be some stuff we're going to need to stop doing. I worry about resetting from these wars, and it's going to take us, we'll get 2 years of dwell time here in the next few years, but we're not really reset for 2 years as opposed to instantaneously when that starts. And so I worry about properly resetting during a time where the challenges in the world continue to grow, and no better example than just the last couple of weeks. And I think that will continue. If you track crises back over the course of the time the Secretary's been here and I've been in this job, they continue to grow. I am comfortable that we have the best military we've ever had, our young men and women, and we just need to make sure that we sustain that over the long term. We'll talk a lot about equipment in these hearings. If we get it right for our people and our families, we'll be fine. And if we don't, it'll be a real struggle. And then in two specific areas, not that we don't have challenges, as have been mentioned, but two specific areas are of great concern to me. One is space, and the other is cyber. And those are areas that are what I would call too often niche areas. They're not anymore. They're domains without boundaries, without rules. We have international players as well as individuals, particularly on the cyber side, extremely dangerous in both realms, particularly in cyber. We've invested in that heavily. We've stood up a command. Those are initial steps. We've got a long way to go.
Mr. Secretary, did you want to respond to that?
I would, since this is my last hearing, I'll be bold and tell you two things that worry me, and they both have to do with the Congress. One is the disconnect between the roles and missions that have been given to the military by the Congress and the President and the discussion of the defense budget now and in the future here on the Hill, where it is treated more often than not as a math problem. You have 18.9% of federal outlays, which I might add is the lowest percentage of federal outlays for defense other than the late 90s, early 2000s, since before World War II. And yet, because we have $500 billion, then we must be part of the problem in terms of the nation's debt and the deficit. I would tell you that on a $1.6 trillion deficit, if you cut the Defense Department by 10%, which operationally would be catastrophic, that's $50 billion. You haven't gotten very far toward dealing with the deficit. The second thing that I worry about is that what we have found in the executive branch is that the elements of the different parts of the executive branch are increasingly integrated in the way they deal with problems. The State Department and the Defense Department and AID. And yet the jurisdictional lines here on the Hill are such that you don't get to see the overall national security picture that we see in the Situation Room or that the President sees, that brings intelligence and the State Department and defense and these different elements together and integrate those. And I think it's a challenge because this is becoming more and more the case in the problems that the nation is dealing with in national security. And yet the Congress continues to have essentially a stovepiped approach to dealing with these issues. And this is one of the reasons the State Department doesn't get enough money. And so as you all think about the future, those are two things that concern me.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll submit other questions for the record. Thank you.
Thank you. We're going to turn to Mr. Wilson, and then we're going to take a 5-minute short break. Mr. Wilson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Admiral, Mr. Secretary, thank you for being here today. And in particular, Admiral and Secretary Gates, I want to thank you for your service as you highlight the conclusion of your careers in the military, serving our service members. I do have the same concern of our chairman. It's a bipartisan concern. I was listening to Congressman Reyes, and that is with the drawdown, with the force reduction in the Army and Marine Corps. I'm very concerned. The effect on dwell time. I'm very concerned about the effect on morale of the service members, on their families, the consequence of them not feeling secure as to their military futures, of people who have been so dedicated to our country. With that in mind, and it's been stated that it's going to be conditions-based, Mr. Secretary, what flexibility will there be for the service chiefs in terms of the conditions? And I would, it's my view that the conditions have even changed in the last month with the instability in the Middle East, the potential of facing an asymmetric enemy on a broader scale that would require more boots on the ground.
Well, I think that your concern about an asymmetric threat is correct. And I would tell you that I think that those who will face this asymmetric threat to the greatest extent are, in fact, the Air Force and the Navy, particularly as we look at capabilities that China and others are developing, the kinds of activities that the Iranians are engaged in, and North Koreans, and so on. That's why we put a freeze on both the Air Force and the Navy in 2007. We're drawing down their personnel, and we stopped that. And so there are no drawdowns planned for the Air Force and the Navy. As I said earlier, the Marine Corps, this is their idea, and I think you need to talk to General Amos and get his thinking and his logic in terms of why the Marine Corps ought to be smaller and lighter, assuming we come out of Afghanistan. And I would tell you, the kinds of instability that we're seeing in the Middle East now, it is difficult for me to imagine circumstances in which we would send U.S. ground forces in any of those situations. Those are problems that are emanating from within those countries, and it's primarily a diplomatic challenge for us, although I would say if you ever wanted proof of the value, as the chairman said in his opening statement, of the value of our military assistance to Egypt over the past 30 years, it has been in the behavior of the Egyptian army over the past 3 weeks and their professionalism in dealing with the kinds of situations they have. But look, 2015 is a long way away, and I think that the department, and we're talking about $6 billion. So I think that the service chiefs have a lot of flexibility in terms of if they determine in 2013, 14, thereabouts, that drawing down from 547,000 or from 187,000 in the case of the Marine Corps or of 202,000 rather, then they can obviously make that pitch. I would tell you, though, a lot's going to depend on who's the Secretary of Defense and who's the President, because there had been opposition within the Department of Defense to increasing end strength when I arrived, and that's why it hadn't happened. Previous chairman of this committee had been a strong advocate of increasing end strength, and many of you had been as well. But it didn't happen until you had a different Secretary of Defense, so that will matter too, as well as the service chiefs.
And I do want to commend the surge, I think successful in Afghanistan. I'm very grateful that so many of the Army personnel were trained at Fort Jackson that I represent, Parris Island Marines, making such a difference. Also, in regard, Secretary, to the National Guard, what is the status of our equipping of the National Guard for their domestic and foreign capabilities?
This is a real success story. This is something that I'm pretty proud of. When I came to this job, the equipment on hand across the nation on average for the National Guard was about 40%. It's now in the mid-70s. The historical equipment on hand for the Guard is about 70%, so we're well above that. But more importantly than that is that they're getting first-line equipment. They're not getting hand-me-downs from the active force. They're getting the same high-quality, high-tech equipment that the active force is.
Thank you very much.
Committee will take a 5-minute recess and reconvene at 10 minutes to 12. Got any feel for the joint?
And that one's off. We'll push it again.
Test it.